Okay, so what I'm going to do today, I'll introduce you to the context of Gaelic, which is the language I've been working on mostly. I've probably ambitiously decided to introduce you to a couple of studies I've been working on over the past few years. So the first study, I'll talk about adolescent Gaelic speakers who are in immersion schooling, and also about their acquisition or non-acquisition of Gaelic phonology and aspects of dialect. In the second study, I'm going to talk about L1 Gaelic speaking adults, and I'll touch on the ultrasound methods that we've been using in our lab, some acoustics as well, and rhotic consonants. Then I'll try and bring all of that together with a bit of discussion, and I don't think I'm going to have time for future projects, so I've got rid of that bullet point, but I can tell you about the stuff we're working on in the future as well in the questions if anyone is interested. I know everyone's not necessarily a phonetician here, so I'll try and keep it phonetics light. And I know you're all interested in bilingualism and L2 contexts. The way I came to this really was sort of accidentally. So I came at it from a sociolinguist and a phonetics perspective, but working on Gaelic, I have to work on bilingualism because that's the context. So that's sort of how I've come to this research area, and I'll hopefully show you through some of my projects how I kind of incorporated lots of different theoretical perspectives that will hopefully be interesting to you as well as me. So we'll get going. I mostly work on Scottish Gaelic, which is a Celtic language closely related to Irish. It was a majority language of Scotland if we think back to around 1100 Common Era. So a while back it was a majority language of Scotland. But since then there's a sort of depressing history of minoritisation and persecution. In terms of where speakers are located, there's a map on the right hand side of the slide showing the density of Gaelic speakers, and darker green is denser concentration. So the northwest chain of islands off the coast of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides, is around 50 to 60% Gaelic speaking, and then that kind of gets less and less as you go southwards and eastwards in Scotland. You'll notice these data are from the 2011 census. These are the latest available figures we have for the number of Gaelic speakers. The census in Scotland was done last year, so we're sort of nervously / eagerly awaiting the results of that. But the 2011 census shows around 58,000 speakers in Scotland, which is about 1% of the population. There's now a significant revitalisation programme happening for Gaelic in Scotland. This was kind of recently centred around the Gaelic Language Act of 2005, which in theory gives Gaelic equal status to English in Scotland. I'm saying in theory because in practice things are a little bit different, and we also have British Sign Language since 2015, which also has equal status in Scotland, in theory. There's a form of immersion schooling available mostly across Scotland, and this is known as Gaelic medium education. I say a form of immersion schooling because one of the differences between Gaelic medium and a lot of immersion schooling programs is that children from all language backgrounds kind of mixed up in the immersion school classroom. So you get children who've acquired Gaelic at home working with children who have no Gaelic at all right from the start of their immersion schooling experience. So it's kind of immersion schooling, but with some differences based on the context. There's also a Gaelic BBC TV channel and a Gaelic radio channel, very active arts and cultural scene. The poster here says Misnoch, which means confidence, and I think the idea is that it's an advert for Gaelic medium education, for immersion education, and you can give your child lots of benefits and some wonderful bilingual outcomes. Also confidence if you put them in Gaelic medium education. So I quite like that nice poster for immersion schooling opportunities. There's quite a lot of variation in the sociolinguistic situation of Gaelic across Scotland. I'm today going to be talking about speakers from the Isle of Lewis, which is the most northerly island in the Outer Hebrides. And I was there a week ago, just over a week ago, collecting data. So it's a very beautiful part of the world. And I'm also going to be talking about Gaelic speakers in Glasgow, which is the largest city in Scotland, and it's located in the sort of middle lowland part of the country. If we think about Gaelic on the Isle of Lewis, in terms of numbers, this is the most Gaelic speaking place in the world. There's about 60% Gaelic speakers. And there's a steady growth of Gaelic immersion education in Lewis. So this is sort of gradually building. Recently, the council instigated a policy by which your child is automatically enrolled in Gaelic medium education unless you specifically opt out. Whereas previously it was the other way around. You could opt in to Gaelic medium education. Now it's kind of an opt-out policy. Children also might receive Gaelic input from their family and neighbours if they're acquiring Gaelic, but it's now more and more rare for Gaelic to be used outside the home and designated Gaelic speaking spaces. And even in this numerically very Gaelic speaking part of the world, it's very common for children to mainly use Gaelic only at school. Glasgow, big city, but it has a long history of Gaelic speaking migration from the 1600s onwards. Statistically, it's about 1% Gaelic speaking, so a lot less in terms of numbers than Lewis. But there's been a very rapid expansion of Gaelic medium education. When I conducted my PhD in 2013, there was one Gaelic school. There's now 3 and plans to open another one. So it's expanding very fast. Gaelic is quite well supported institutionally, but it's rarely used outside designated Gaelic speaking spaces. And for the vast majority of children acquiring Gaelic, this is through Gaelic medium education in the school, and it's rarely used by them outside of the classroom. So in the playground, English is the language of choice usually. So sort of quite different sociolinguistic contexts as we go across the country. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about these different contexts, and I'll show you some of the studies I've been doing as well. If we think about people using Gaelic and the outcomes on their language use, there's quite a lot of factors that might go into this. I'm coming at this specifically from the perspective of speech production, but you could also apply all of this to grammar and other areas of the language system as well. Almost all Gaelic speakers are at least bilingual in Gaelic and English. I say almost all, maybe excluding the very young and the very, very old, but pretty much everyone is bilingual. Some people also speak other languages as well. So as we know, in speech or language used by bilinguals, we're going to expect bidirectional cross-linguistic influence in some of their language production. And also we might expect differences between speakers based on the timing and nature of their multilingual acquisition. So are they acquiring it from L1 speaking parents at home? Are they acquiring it through the school system? These might be differences we would expect based on the bilingualism and multilingualism literature. We're also working in a context of language minoritization and obsolescence. So some of the literature on this is slightly depressing. Nancy Dorian and Mari Jones have worked extensively on language obsolescence and the impacts on the language system, for example. And there's a really nice quote from Nancy Dorian where she describes rapid and widespread language change is to be expected in a context of language obsolescence. So we might expect some kind of structural changes based on the sociolinguistic situation. In the case of Gaelic and many other minority endangered languages, we've also got centuries of language contact. So Gaelic and English have been in contact for at least 200 years in Lewis, and before that there was also contact with Old Norse. So we've got lots and lots of language contact going on. And in the case of Gaelic and English, English is the nationally and internationally as well, you could argue, dominant language. So we might expect kind of transfer from English to Gaelic, but also transfer the other way depending on the language contact situation. So we're going to get some kind of changes, differences going on based on that. Within this setting, speakers are also going about their daily lives and interacting with the world. So we have to take into account their kind of personal identity as a minority language user. On the one hand, sometimes this history of persecution, minoritization and intergenerational trauma can lead to feelings of shame or lack of wanting to use the language in some particular context, lack of confidence. But also, on the other hand, people are very aware of the endangerment situation, are very proud of their language, and sometimes do take steps to actively promote it, actively maintain certain aspects of the language and its culture. So we've kind of got lots of things going on in there, which I'm going to touch on in this talk as well. Within a setting of language endangerment and language revitalization, some of the context for language use might be limited or different to a majority language situation, and also some of the opportunities for language use might be different or limited compared to, for example, English. And I've already touched on that with children in immersion education. Often they're only using the language in the classroom. So we've got lots and lots of different factors going into the language people are actually going to produce, encounter and use. And I'm going to explain how some of these have had an effect on my research and how I've tried to investigate some of these. The first study I'm going to talk to you about today is about speech production in adolescents who are learning Gaelic, acquiring Gaelic, using Gaelic in Gaelic medium education. So that's the Scottish version of immersion education. If you want more information, it's in International Journal of Bilingualism and was done in collaboration with Dom Moran, who was one of our undergrads, and I really, really wanted him to carry on and do a PhD. So I worked with him on this paper, but unfortunately, he didn't. But Dom Moran, wonderful collaborator for this. The research questions we addressed in this study were: how do young Gaelic speakers in Gaelic medium education produce aspects of Gaelic phonology, produce features of traditional dialects, and thirdly, negotiate the tension between local identity, peer group identity as teenagers, they're still teenagers at the end of the day, and using Gaelic out with traditional Gaelic speaking areas. So I'm going to focus on Glasgow in this particular situation, which is, as you saw from the map and the numbers, not traditionally a very strong Gaelic speaking area, but lots of children are learning Gaelic in this place. So our focus is on Glasgow, and I actually collected these data during my PhD, which was some time ago now, but we hopefully produce some kind of fresh analysis and data from this. I recorded 22 speakers in Glasgow, aged 13 to 14, and for this they are compared to 15 teenagers from the Isle of Lewis, from the Outer Hebrides, again aged 13 to 14, and we did a kind of sort of baseline comparison to 3 traditional older speakers in Lewis, aged 60 to 80. So we've got our traditional Gaelic L1 users and comparing them to adolescent speakers in immersion education. For this, we used self-reported Gaelic use with parents as a proxy for language inputs and kind of background of acquiring Gaelic. The situation for young people in Gaelic medium education today is that not many of them use Gaelic with their families. So in the Glasgow sample, we had 22 young people, 4 of them used Gaelic with 1 parent. In the Lewis sample, so this is the most Gaelic speaking place in the world, 5 out of 15 used Gaelic with 1 parent. In both cases, no one used Gaelic with both their parents. Or there were several different family combinations, but no one grew up with 2 Gaelic speaking parents, essentially. For our quantitative analysis, we're using word list data here, and we focused on aspects of Gaelic phonology which are not shared with English. So I'll give you some examples of these in the moment, because I'm aware not everyone works on Gaelic and not everyone's a phonetician, but we looked at pre-aspiration, we looked at vowel nasalization, and we looked at vowel length, but I'm not going to present that today. And we also looked at traditional aspects of the Lewis dialect. So this is a study really focused on Glasgow, and you might be thinking, well, why is traditional Lewis dialect of interest to young people in Glasgow? Over half of the teachers in the school in Glasgow were from Lewis, and this is fairly common across Gaelic medium education. Lewis dialect speakers are sort of overrepresented in the teacher population. So if it's the case that children in Gaelic medium education sort of reproduce the input that they are given, then we might expect to see some aspects of Lewis dialect. I'll give you a couple of examples now. Pre-aspiration refers to a sort of breathiness between a vowel and a consonant. So in English we have post-aspiration in words like tap with a tap. In English they have pre-aspiration. So the word for a goat is spelt B-O-C and it's pronounced boch. I'll give you an example of this, and you're going to hear the word achke with a in the middle of it. Can you hear that? No. Can you hear that at all now? No? Okay, I'll try once more to share the sound. Give it another go. Okay, let's try once more. Any joy? Yes? No? Okay. It sounds like achke, and we're measuring pre-aspiration, which is the bit in the middle of it. We took a measure of voiceless pre-aspiration as a proportion of the vowel. So we took the whole start of the vowel to the end of the pre-aspiration and measured voiceless pre-aspiration as a proportion of that. So the breathy bit. We also looked at vowel nasalization, and in Gaelic, vowels can be phonemically nasalized, but the extent of nasalization is lexically specific, dialectally specific, and idiolectally. So we've got even some traditional dialect studies that say that this varies quite a lot, person to person. We picked words which would be typically nasalized in Lewis dialect. For example, the word for quiet or calm is sainvoch, with a sainvoch, a nasalized vowel in the first syllable. This was an auditory analysis, so we listened to see if there was perceptible nasalization or not. We also looked at some Lewis dialect shibboleths. These are particular words which are well known to have a different pronunciation in the Lewis dialect compared to southern dialects of Gaelic. So we had 6 different words which are pronounced well known to be quite different in Lewis, and the most stereotypical of these is the word for milk, which is produced as bonya in Lewis and banya elsewhere. So it's a difference, it's very salient to Gaelic speakers whether it's bonya or banya. So we did some auditory coding of that as well, and various other words. We then did some linear mixed effects modelling, looking at speaker group. And we conducted separate modelling on the young people, which included gender and whether they had Gaelic with one parent at home. We also did a little bit of qualitative analysis. So this was a very basic qualitative analysis. I think if we did it again, I might do something differently. But we looked at the overt attitudes expressed by the young people in their interviews. I'm going to focus on the Glasgow people here, and did some very simple content analysis of where they didn't say something like, oh, I don't know. I guess you get what you get when you ask teenagers to describe how they feel sometimes, don't you? I picked 2 questions from the interviews, which are, what do you think about Lewis Gaelic, and what's your accent in Gaelic? So we'll have a look at some results now. For the pre-aspiration, we unsurprisingly found that there was more pre-aspiration in the stops where we'd expect it, in the aspirated stops. And we found some linguistic context effects as well, which is sort of as expected. Most interestingly, in terms of the social results, we found an interaction of speaker group and stop series. So it's the case that all of our speaker groups were doing pre-aspiration. The traditional dialect speakers are pre-aspirating, the Lewis Young speakers are pre-aspirating, the Glasgow speakers are also pre-aspirating. But if you look at the interaction plot at the bottom, the Lewis older speakers are pre-aspirating more. So they make more of a distinction between their aspirated and unaspirated stops. But everyone was pre-aspirating, so happy days, I guess. Also, interestingly, we found no significant differences for gender or home language background. So whether or not you have Gaelic at home with one of your parents doesn't appear to make a difference to pre-aspiration in young people. Going on to some nasal vowels, what we did here is we coded them auditorily. They're all expected to be nasal in Lewis dialect. Green is what we heard as nasal, and purple is what we heard as non-nasal. For the Lewis Old speakers, so each of the plots is one word, and we've got the 3 speaker groups: Lewis Old speakers, Lewis Young speakers, and Glasgow speakers. The Lewis Old speakers were 100% nasal in some words, and a little bit less nasal than some of the other ones. The Lewis Young speakers, a bit less nasal than the Lewis Older speakers, and the Glasgow speakers, not very nasal at all. So again, they're all producing nasal vowels, but the younger speakers aren't doing it as much as the older speakers. And in this case, the Glasgow speakers were doing it less than the Lewis Young speakers. Going on to our dialect features, We've coded these as Lewis dialect variant or not Lewis dialect variant. Lewis variants are in green and supra-regional features are in purple. And again, we've got our set of different words and then the 3 speaker groups along the bottom. The Lewis older speakers produced Lewis variants, perhaps unsurprisingly, 100% of the time in some of the words and a bit less of the time in the other words. The young Glasgow speakers never produced any Lewis dialect features. And the Lewis younger speakers somewhere in the middle. A couple of examples of what you think of Lewis Gaelic. It'd be really nice if these sound clips work because then you can hear the voices of the speakers. So we asked the young people, what do you think of Lewis Gaelic? I'll see if this plays now, that would be really nice. No. She says, I quite like strong Gaelic, like pronunciation, larger. I've heard this too many times. I'm doing like a Glasgow Gaelic accent at this point. But Tara says she thinks the pronunciation is quite strong, and I think she's referring to the dialectal differences that she hears. Miranda says, Haimar like a granny voice. So she associates it with perhaps an older demographic. No, hi well, hi Jifricha, like Mar, really polite. So she thinks of it as associated with perhaps an old generation, but maybe some kind of proper Gaelic usage. Will says, well, hayet gma slurdoch. They're quite slow, so maybe again associating with perhaps an older generation. Sophie, her family are from Lewis, so she was the one that has maybe the strongest reaction to this question. Hama Lewis, hayets and Jifricha, the best, the right one. So she code switches into English, perhaps for extra effect. And going on to what the young people thought their accent was in Gaelic, Tara says, Haima like na teacherin, hana accents achas and Jifricha, hunskabiliets and the chain for Suis, for na Helen ach ma hana accents, ek ma like na scholar and Jifricha, hunskabil shinia for like glasachu, agus archich and shears and shaw. So Tara thinks that teachers are different because they're from a specific island, but young people in Glasgow have their own accent because that's where they're from. And Vicky says, Hamidjirachus Munchin gavil me a brian ma anabiola ach Gaelic. So she thinks she transfers her English accent over into Gaelic, which I thought was super interesting. So we've got a small number of comments about the students' own perceptions of their accents, and they're well aware that they sound different to traditional dialects. And Vicky seems aware that she sounds like someone from Glasgow, which is maybe unsurprising, but it's not the case that they hear what their teachers are saying and then faithfully reproduce it. They're developing their own practices as well and are aware of this. To summarise all of that, we found that older Lewis speakers show greatest difference between aspirated and unaspirated stops. And we found that Glasgow speakers produced fewest nasal vowels. We found that Glasgow speakers produced no features of Lewis dialect. In each case, we found no significant differences for home language background. So all of the features we looked at here, there was no significant difference between the students who had Gaelic at home and those who did not. In the qualitative analysis, we found that there's some awareness that Glasgow Gaelic sounds different to traditional dialects, and this is in some way linked to personal and local identity. I'm going to briefly show you another study that we published last year. This is looking at rhotic consonants in Gaelic L1 users. And I'm going to bring everything together at the end and explain some of the implications for bilingualism and L2 contexts. This is work done in collaboration with Sam Kirkham from our department. So we're working on sonorant consonants, L's, N's and R's. This is a very large system in Gaelic. It's described as a three-way contrast between palatalized consonants, plain consonants and velarized consonants in laterals, nasals and rhotics. So this is a 9-way sonorant contrast, whereas in English we just have the 3. It's descended from Old Irish, which was even bigger with 4 laterals, 4 nasals and 4 rhotics. But in modern Gaelic, we just have the velarized, plain and palatalized for L's, N's and R's. And I'm going to play you some examples in a moment. Or I might have to produce them myself. We'll see what happens. Firstly, for this study, we wanted to see if speakers produce all of these rhotics. So we've got a velarized one, a plain one, and a palatalized one. And secondly, how they maintain these distinct productions. Why these questions? Well, we were really interested in palatalized rhotics in particular because they are described as articulatorily challenging. The reason for that is to produce a rhotic trill, you need to retract your tongue body. But to produce palatalization, you need to front your tongue body. So those two things kind of don't match together. Also, we know that rhotics are perceptually more similar to each other than, for example, laterals. So there are kind of perceptual and articulation challenges in maintaining a large rhotic system. The other languages and dialects related to Gaelic don't have 3 rhotics anymore. And worldwide, only 3% of languages have 3 or more rhotics. So having a large rhotic system is typologically very unusual. The speakers for this study all grew up in Gaelic-speaking homes on the Isle of Lewis. They all used or had previously used, if they were retired, Gaelic in professional contexts. They acquired English pretty much simultaneously via connection with non-family members, the media and the community. So for this, we aim to get Gaelic dominant L1 speakers, and that's quite challenging in the context of endangerment and minoritization. So we ended up with quite a large age range. We have speakers aged 21 to 80, but they were socially consistent in reporting more use of Gaelic than English and using Gaelic in a professional setting. To illustrate that point, this picture is from the data collection. I don't usually routinely just take random pictures of my participants because that's kind of wrong. But this guy turned up with his own film crew. He's a journalist and he works for the Gaelic television channel. So they came down to see what was going on and do the study as well. So I figured if he was happy being on the TV, then he wouldn't mind me pinching their photo. He's wearing an ultrasound helmet, which is stabilizing the ultrasound probe. I'll tell you a little bit more about the methods as we go along. Collected the data in Stornoway, which is on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. And for this project, I collected simultaneous acoustic and ultrasound data. And the ultrasound is recording about 100 frames per second. We conducted an auditory and acoustic analysis of 12 speakers. And the ultrasound analysis, we did a subsample of that based on who imaged the best. And I can tell you more about the decisions that went into that if you're interested as well. And this is word list data, word initial and word final sonorants in 3 different vowel contexts. And that's some of our recording set up in an office at the BBC. For ultrasound data, you get a side view of the tongue. So it's essentially a way to see the mid-sagittal view of the tongue through the cheek, which is a view we don't usually get. And the images that you see on ultrasounds look like a thick white line. That thick white line is the surface of the tongue. And the tongue back is typically towards the left of the fan and the tongue tip is on the right. And it will be in the videos that I'm going to hopefully show you in a moment. So I've got some videos here. I've got Feed, which is produced with a palatalized rhotic at the end, Far, which is produced with a plain rhotic at the end, and Shar, which is produced with a velarized rhotic at the end. I'm hoping the video will play even if you can't hear the audio, so it's quite nice to see the tongue move, but I'll play those for you now. This is Feed with a palatalized rhotic. And in each case, it plays it twice, once full speed and then once quarter speed. So you can hopefully see the thick white line, which is the surface of the tongue. We've also put a thin green line on the video, which shows the approximate position of the hard palate. So I'll play that for you again, and then I'll play the other 2. This is Feed. This is Far. And then this is Shar, which has a velarized rhotic. Well, hopefully you at least get some kind of impression of the sort of data that we're working with and what the images look like. We did quite a lot of analysis, and I won't go into all of the details now, but we did an auditory analysis where we did a narrow transcription of what was going on, and then collapsed them into bigger categories. We did an acoustic analysis looking at formant ratios during the vowel and the rhotic, or the rhotic and the vowel, depending on word position. And in our ultrasound analysis, we fitted splines. So we fitted a line to that thick white line, which is the surface of the tongue. And then we did GAMS, generalized additive models, on those spline curves to compare across consonants within the same speaker. To compare across speakers, we did a principal component analysis of the spline data, because you get these very rich sets of coordinates with a tongue spline. So we use principal component analysis to break that down a little bit, and then we can compare across speakers and across consonants with those the output of the principal component analysis. So I'll take you through some results quite briefly. This is the results of our auditory coding. We did a very narrow phonetic transcription, then collapsed it into 4 broader categories. Word initial rhotics are on the left, word final rhotics are on the right, and in each case you've got velarized rhotics, plain and palatalized rhotics. Just eyeballing the data, it's obvious that word initial and word final rhotics are realised quite differently. We have a lot more yellow, a lot more approximants in word initial position, and a lot more red, a lot more taps in word final position. It was the case that there was more palatalization in the phonemically palatalized category, so that was quite nice to see. We also had a small number of trills in every context. And this is quite typical for languages that are reported to have trills. People don't realise them as full trills all of the time. These results seem to be roughly comparable to Russian, but it might vary depending on trilling languages. Trills aren't realised as full trills all of the time. In terms of our acoustic analysis, again, I've plotted velarized, plain and palatalized rhotics, and we've got measurements during the rhotic and during the vowel. We found significant differences for phoneme. This is word initial position, and we found the palatalized rhotic was really quite different from the other phonemes. In word final position, we took a slightly different measure for the word final rhotic. This is because there's a lot of devoicing in Gaelic, so we couldn't get our formant measures, but we took centre of gravity, which is an acoustic measure suitable for voiceless sounds. We again found significant differences for phoneme, and in this case, for the formant analysis of the vowel, we found that the velarized one was most different. For the centre of gravity analysis of the rhotic, we found that the palatalized one was most different. So we are finding differences overall for phonemic category. Going on to our ultrasound analysis, I've plotted the data from one speaker here to explain what's going on, and then I'll show you the whole data set. We've got word initial rhotics and word final rhotics, and we've got 3 vowel contexts, so that's why there's 6 panes for each speaker. In each individual panel, we've got velarized rhotics in red, green is plain rhotics, and palatalized is blue. There weren't examples of every single rhotic in every single cell for the different vowels, so that's why there's some palatalized ones missing in some places. There's quite a lot of variation across vowel contexts, but broadly speaking, we found that the velarized rhotics are produced with a retracted tongue shape and the palatalized rhotics with a fronted and raised tongue shape. Palatalized rhotic is a little bit limited in contexts where it occurs. So that was one speaker. And if we look at the whole data set now, and we've got 7 speakers here, I don't expect you to look at the phonemic differences between speakers here because it's very small, and I realise that. But what I've done with this figure is I wanted to show you there's 2 broad different strategies for realising rhotic consonants amongst our speakers. Along the top row, all of the speakers produce rhotics with the tongue tip raised. And along the bottom row, all of the speakers produce rhotics with the tongue tip lowered. Interestingly, speakers are internally consistent, so if they produce one rhotic phoneme with a lowered tongue tip, they produce them all with a lowered tongue tip. This has been noted for other languages, well, English, that there seems to be these 2 broad strategies in rhotic articulation. I've looked at these data every which way. I thought maybe there's an age pattern, maybe there's a gender pattern, but I can't find any sociolinguistic correlation with the results. So we agree with people who've worked on English previously to suggest that this is speaker-specific variation in articulation. We also did some principal component analysis to compare across speakers. We found that 4 principal components accounted for quite a lot of the data, and the red and blue lines indicate the extent of the variation explained by each principal component. The black line is the mean tongue shape of all of the different consonants. I can go into more detail if anyone's particularly interested in how we did this, but basically we found that principal component 1 accounted for quite a lot of the data set and appears to show tongue backing and lowering. Principal component 2 is more about tongue body raising and tongue tip action, etc., etc. We did some stats on the output of the principal component analysis, and to summarise all of that, we found significant differences for phonemic category, mostly in the first three principal components and mostly in word initial position. So I'll start to bring everything together now and then stop speaking. We thought that this study would be a sad story about language change, because Gallic's got this very unusual 3-way rhotic contrast. It's typologically unusual, it's articulatorily challenging, it's perceptually difficult, but actually it was really a story about language maintenance. So we don't really have evidence of change within our current sample. We looked at some of the dialect surveys. We don't have strong evidence of change since the dialect surveys were conducted in the middle of the 20th century. We think that they're still doing their 3 rhotics, so that's wonderful. We were interested in how they're doing it, and also can the sociolinguistic context of revitalization help explain some of our results. We link this to how synchronic variation in Gallic can tell us more about diachronic change across languages, but I'm not going to go into detail on that just now. So how are speakers producing all of these? We think that the individual differences in articulation might perhaps explain this. Maybe speakers are producing something individualized to their anatomy. And we also saw that full trills are rare. So perhaps if palatalizing and trilling are difficult, you just don't trill, you produce palatalization instead. And we found adaptations based on prosodic context. More sociolinguistically interesting, we think that the speakers themselves are contributing to this in some way. So I'm going to return to this guy who turned up to our study with his own film crew. Our sample were all language professionals, so were Gallic dominant bilinguals, and they were willing to do an ultrasound study. And this is quite an odd thing to do, just during your lunch break, just turn up and have your tongue recorded. So I guess a certain kind of person volunteers for this study. We asked anyone and everyone to turn up, but the people who did turn up were all professional Gallic users. This is quite a new development for the Gallic context. So previously, got language endangerment, the middle and upper classes of Gallic speaking society either shifted to English or moved away and were replaced by English speakers. So Gallic kind of lost its middle and upper classes around the 17th century. What's happening nowadays because of revitalization, if you're a Gallic user and an adult, you tend to be in a middle class profession. So there's been quite a big social change recently for Gallic. The people who are working in Gallic tend to be highly educated and also educated about Gallic. So the younger half of our sample all had degrees in Gallic, and as part of that, they know about 3-way rhotic contrasts. So it's possible and very likely that they knew about the 3-way rhotic system, and either in their daily life they go out of their way to try and produce it, or they were producing it for the purposes of this study and having their tongue recorded. This is quite a new development for the language, and all of the speakers are highly committed to Gallic and its revitalization. So we think that this might be feeding into some of our data. On the one hand, you could say this is a weird sample, but on the other hand, you could say this is actually representative of the Gallic L1 using adult community. I probably would say this, but I would probably argue for the latter of those explanations. To bring everything together that I've talked about today, When we're thinking about bilingualism and L2 users, we're often very concerned with their input, how they acquired the language contact situation, and the social factors. But some of the results that I found from working with the Gaelic community kind of challenge some of our preconceptions about what's going to be really different if you acquired Gaelic in the home compared to if you acquired Gaelic at school. And some of our preconceptions have been kind of challenged when I've seen some of my results. For example, from the first study, we saw that children and adolescents tend to form new group norms, which don't necessarily reflect their background and input. So in this study and in previous studies that I've done, we've found almost no differences between young people who use Gaelic at home and those who acquired it through the school system. So it seems there's some kind of teenager effect going on where they end up sounding like each other rather than their home background inputs or the input received from their teachers. In the second study, we thought it would be about language change, but actually it was about language maintenance. And I'm suggesting that maybe the context of language revitalization can lead to maintenance of a system where we might otherwise expect change. And the specifics of these patterns might be a feature of the Gaelic context, but more generally, I'm arguing that sociolinguistic factors are really important in understanding any multilingual community. So that is everything, probably relieved here. Thank you.